Today we turn from demand to supply. There are a lot of parallels between supply and demand. Just as we carefully distinguish between changes in demand and changes in quantity demanded, now we're going to have to carefully distinguish between changes in supply and changes in quantity supplied. Quantity demanded, recall, told us how much of a good consumers want to buy at a particular price. Quantity supplied tells us how much of a good firms want to sell at a particular price. In the graph in front of you, if the price of widgets is 8, firms want to sell 120 widgets. As demand was all about consumers and what consumers wanted, supply tells us all about producers or firms or businesses. Those all basically mean the same thing in economics. Recall that demand curves had negative slope. That's because as the price goes up, consumers wanted to buy less of a good. That came down to the fact that consumers like money, and when you buy a good, you give up money. Well, firms like money too, and this is why supply curves have a positive slope, because as the price of a good goes up, firms are more willing to sell that good, because firms like money, and when you sell a good, you get money for it. So the more money you can get for a good, the happier you are to sell this good. Think of yourself. Imagine you're working as a babysitter. The more people are willing to pay you to babysit, probably the more willing you are to babysit. So the positive relationship between price and quantity supplied comes about because firms like money and are more willing to produce goods the more money they get for each good. Consider this supply curve for wheat. If the price of wheat were 8, firms would want to sell 120 units. If the price were to go up to 13, then firms would be moving from point A to point B and would now want to sell 280 units of wheat. If all you do is change the price of wheat, you move along the supply curve for wheat. You do not get a new supply of wheat because, as with demand, supply is the entire relationship between price and quantity. So in general, if you change the price of X, you move along the demand curve for X. You do not get a new demand curve for X. Similarly, if you change the price of X, you move along the supply curve for X. You do not get a new supply of X. Sometimes people make a mistake when thinking about supply because they're thinking about supply purely from the point of view of a consumer. The mistake goes like this. It's where people say, well, if the price goes down, people will want to buy more, so firms will be able to sell more. So doesn't that mean that quantity supplied should go up as price goes down? That's wrong, because quantity supplied is answering the theoretical question, if the price were this, how much would firms be willing to sell? So let's consider an absurd example. What is the quantity supplied of Pepsi if the price of Pepsi were $1 billion a bottle? Now, obviously, at $1 billion a bottle, quantity demanded is 0. But quantity supplied is going to be massive. If Pepsi could sell as much Pepsi as it wanted at $1 billion a bottle, it would sell a huge amount. So quantity supplied at a very high price is high. That's true even if consumers wouldn't actually want to buy any of the goods at that price. This again is because of the definition of quantity supplied. Quantity supplied is asking the question, if firms could sell as much as they wanted at a particular price, how much would they want to sell? Let's go back to the supply curve for wheat. Let's say we're at point A where the price of wheat is $8. Now let's imagine that the price of fertilizer falls. Farmers use fertilizer to make wheat. So a fall in the price of fertilizer, that should cause farmers to be willing to make more wheat, even if you hold the price of wheat the same. But we're not allowed to move along the supply curve for wheat if all we do is we change the price of fertilizer. And this is analogous to what happened with demand. A supply curve is two-dimensional. We're only allowed to change two things as we move along it. And those two things are the price of that good and the quantity of that good. So if we change something else, we need an entirely new supply curve. So if we change the price of fertilizer, we have to move to a new supply curve for wheat. So if the price of fertilizer falls, we move from point A to point B, where point B is on an entirely new supply curve. You can imagine that there's an enormous number of supply curves for wheat, each corresponding to a different price of fertilizer. Since farmers should be more willing to grow wheat as you lower the price of fertilizer, as the supply curves move to the right or shift out, that should correspond to a lower price of fertilizer. If you increase the price of wheat, you move along the supply curve for wheat. You don't change the supply for wheat. You do change the quantity supplied of wheat. But if you change the price of fertilizer, you move to a new supply curve for wheat. You change both the supply and the quantity supplied of wheat. Lots of things other than the price of fertilizer can move a supply curve. Firms are usually concerned with maximizing their profit. So if something affects how costly it is for a firm to make a good, that will often affect supply. So if you raise a firm's labor costs, that will shift in supply. If there's some new technology that makes it cheaper to make a good, that will usually raise supply. Again, please remember, the rule is if you change the price of a good, you move along the supply curve for that good. But if you change something else that's relevant for how much a firm wants to produce, then you need to move to an entirely new supply curve.